Hey, A-pushing dual credit kids, what's a crack-a-lackin'? Today we're moving on with the conquest of the West. I'm calling it Go West for obvious reasons. We're talking about that move after the Civil War to claim and settle and populate the Trans-Mississippi West. Let's take a look at the map in 1860 at the outset of the Civil War. This part of the country, the eastern part, is primarily settled. Now, beyond the Mississippi, we have some settled regions such as Texas and Missouri, but this is largely unsettled with the exception of California, and of course we are talking about white people. In 1862, the federal Congress decides to pass a Homestead Act for the purpose of settling the West. Now, remember, this was part of the Republican platform ever since the 1850s. They wanted to get free white labor to head out and settle the West, and of course it was the Southern senators who were always opposing it because they were hoping that the West would be populated by large slave plantations. Well, when the South secedes, the Republican Congress is pretty much free to do what they want, and they get that Homestead Act. Thanks to the Homestead Act, this is going to be the largest land grab in world history. The U.S. government is going to give away millions of acres of land between 1862 and the 20th century. In fact, the Republican Party adopted a popular jingo that was circulating at the time, which went, "Vote yourself a farm." Settlers are going to come as far away as England, Sweden, Poland, Germany, wherever people are hungry for land. 1/3 of the Americans are going to be freed blacks and single women. Additional land is going to be sold by the railroad companies, which, as you recall, were given land grants by the U.S. government, and now they are going to be turning a profit as that land has improved in value. Well, it's going to be not just a land bonanza, but an advertising bonanza. The U.S. government and the railroad companies, which are eager to entice people to head out there and settle, are going to make some pretty impressive claims, not all of which is going to turn out to be true. But nevertheless, advertise and advertise and advertise they are. They're going to advertise for those millions of lands in Iowa and Nebraska. They're going to say that Nebraska is the garden of the West. That is a little bit of a stretch if you've ever been to Nebraska. There aren't even trees there. But nevertheless, people are going to buy into this and head out there. This one's really interesting to me. The lands good for soil, wheat, corn, and fruit. Well, California might be good for fruit, but I don't know if anybody's ever been out to the far west to places such as Nebraska. You're not really going to grow a lot of fruit there, but nevertheless, these are the claims. As I said, the Republican Party adopted as part of its platform a jingo that was going around. It's called Uncle Sam's Farm, as far as we can know, written in 1860. It says, "A welcome, warm and hearty, do we give the sons of toil, to come to the West and settle and labor on free soil. We've room enough and land enough, they needn't feel alarm. Oh, come to the land of freedom and vote yourself a farm. Then come along, make no delay. Come from every nation, come from every way. Our lands, they are broad enough, don't be alarmed, for Uncle Sam is rich enough to give us all a farm." And so for a $10 filing fee, you can get yourself one of these, a certificate of land claim. You own it, it's yours out there, and all you have to do is live on it for 5 years and improve the land, whatever that means, and you'll own it. In 1869, the process of settlement is made easier when the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad by the U.S. government is made a reality in Ogden, Utah, just north of Salt Lake. And so now you're going to be able to get people and supplies and much needed lumber out to the west faster than before. Well, here they are out in nature's garden. This is the reality for most people who headed out west, finding that it wasn't the garden of the West, it wasn't a garden at all, there weren't very many trees, and there weren't a whole lot of resources from which to build domiciles. Most settlers are going to settle on sod houses, which are basically mud houses. Now they're not as uncomfortable as they seem. They keep rather cool in the summer, and they can be rather warm in the winter. But here you have this typical Victorian-style family living out here on a sod house. Take a look at the windows and take a look at the doors. These are obviously going to need to be imported. Notice the number of single women. The men are not in this picture. I think that's interesting. Again, women, without the presence of men. A lot of women came west looking for land for themselves. Well, in the West, most homesteaders headed out there with a single goal in mind, and that is owning their own land. In Europe or in the East, hardly anyone could hope to own land, so this was truly a dream come true. The chosen occupation was for most farming. There's going to be those who go into mining, and there's going to be those who go into other businesses, but most people want to own their own farm. Now, to some degree, they are duped by the pseudoscience of the day, which tells them that rain follows the plow. This is literally what climatologists and scientists were saying, is that the more human activity there is on the western plains, the more likely it is that rain will happen. There's something that happens, they tell you, that once you dig into the soil, once you start planting, once we begin to settle that area, rain will come. It's not just blind faith. There seems to be a little bit of science behind it, because in the 1860s and 1870s, when people first started moving out there, this was part of a natural climactic cycle of high rainfall. Climatologists know and understand that now. But in the 1880s, that cycle was ending and dry conditions resumed, and resumed with a vengeance. And so what a lot of people found out who were believing that rain follows the plow is that drought is going to follow the plow, and one third of the settlers are going to end up returning home after 1 year. One railroad advertisement made the claim, "Why immigrate to Kansas? Because it is the garden spot of the world, because it will grow anything that the country will grow, and with less work." So a lot of folks bought into it, got their land claim, headed out, and eventually they started saying things like this: "Hurrah for Greer County, the land of the free, the land of the bedbug, grasshopper, and flea. I'll sing of its praises, I'll tell of its fame, while starving to death on my government claim." Another one says, "The bankers followed us out west and did in mortgages invest. They looked ahead and shrewdly planned, and soon they'll have our Kansas land." So what we're finding is that for a lot of settlers, the claims of the railroads and of the U.S. government did not turn out to be as truthful as they had hoped. These advertisers promised settlers a lot. Their claims are quite outrageous. Sprawling farms, bountiful harvests, stately manors, anything you could want, it's all available to you in the West. Again, Kansas is being held up as the garden of the West. You can see on the sides and the top of this advertisement, grapes are growing, bountiful harvest, plentiful rain, everything you'd want. This, of course, is the reality. You've got a whole family here in front of their mud house, not a tree in sight. I certainly don't see any grapes, but you know what? Look at their faces. They're proud of it. It's theirs. In South Texas in the 19th century, there was an untapped resource. And that resource was on four legs and wandering the open range. Of course, we're talking about cows. Beef is a highly sought after commodity. As more and more people are moving into the north and to the east, they're demanding more food. Beef is what they demand, but it's down south and it's very difficult to get there. It's very expensive. There are, as we said, plenty of wild cows wandering the plains and the valleys and the hills of South Texas. The idea is born in the late 19th century that what we need to do is drive the cattle from the south to stockyards in the Midwest and then load them onto trains headed for the north. And this is what gives rise to our famous cattle trails, such as Goodnight Loving, the Western Trail, the Chisholm Trail, and the Sedalia and Baxter Springs Trail, all of them going from South Texas, where they'll hook up with the railroads in the Middle States, and from there they can be shipped to any market that is willing to slaughter them and serve them up on a plate. All of this is made possible by something called the open range. And there you have all your cowboys riding their horses, and in the background you can see cows just wandering free. This is because nobody owns this property and nobody's controlling it, and you can literally drive thousands or hundreds of thousands of cows across these plains without bothering anyone. At this point, we can explore some of the myths and the truths about the cowboy. We are in Texas after all, and because the cowboy animates so much of our pop culture, we should know something about him. One of the myths is that the cowboy was typically a strong and independent white man. Now, of course, there were some strong, independent white men that were cowboys, but the reality is that cowboys and, yes, cowgirls were ethnically mixed. Black people, white people, Hispanic people, and Chinese people made up the bulk of cowboys. They weren't all white, and they made about $25 a month, which is not good money, barely enough to keep a man alive. Another myth is that the cowboy's life is filled with glamour and excitement, just like you see in the movies. Well, cowboys worked about 18 hours a day, and if you're lucky, then your time is going to be boring and uneventful. Another myth is that cowboys often tangled with Native Americans. Who hasn't heard of the famous battles between cowboys and Indians? Well, this didn't happen, at least not to the extent that the movies portray it, because the reality is that most Indians had been killed by the U.S. Army or sent to reservations by the time of the cowboy. And so the battles between cowboys and Indians are more Hollywood than they are reality. Well, the time of the cowboy lasted barely a generation, from the late 1860s till the late 1880s. They called it the long drive, but it wasn't so long, it was really pretty short. Why is that? Well, one of the reasons is that the U.S. government and the railroad companies continued to sell land grants to farmers in Texas and Oklahoma and in Kansas and Nebraska, and farmers, we said that most people who settle out west, farmers don't care for wild cattle grazing on their field, and they don't care for cowboys driving herds through their property. So, the farmers make use of a new invention by two men from Illinois, Henry Sanborn and Joseph Glidden. And that invention is barbed wire. It's a simple invention, but what it does is it is able to keep livestock in, keep the cattle out, and of course, the long drive is going to be cut short because the cowboys are going to have to stop in their tracks and they won't be able to make it all the way up to the stockyards. So the cattle drivers are going to protest, but we're talking about property rights, and these property rights have been granted by the U.S. government or by the railroad companies, which have been granted by the U.S. government. And so the cowboys and the cattle drivers really don't have a legal claim to the land over which they're trying to drive their cattle. And so the end of the trail for the cowboy is more or less 1887. The cowboys tried to protest, and they tried to keep the cattle drives open by engaging in what we call range wars, which is this struggle between the cattle drivers and the farmers to keep the open range open. And there they are, they're the masked men, the bandits of dime store novel fame, who are trying to cut those wires to keep the range open. And you can see the little caption that somebody has written in there. It says, "Settlers taking the law into their own hands by cutting 15 miles from the Brighton Ranch fence in 1885. Of course, this is a losing battle. Barbed wire is going to win, big industry is going to win, and the cowboys are going to lose out. But we can talk about the cowboy's lasting effect. He, of course, had a very strong influence on pop culture, on magazines, on TV shows, on movies. We don't go a generation without seeing a score of cowboy movies. They usually pop up every 20 or 15 years, but this one is pretty important. There's one aspect of the cowboy legacy we just can't overlook. Cowboys did this. When they were singing to their herds, it calmed them and prevented the herds from stampeding. You never want a herd to stampede, because what happens then is it's very tough and difficult to pull them back together. And another reason why you don't want the cows to be moving too fast is because they lose weight by spending more calories, and then they're worth less when you get them up to the stockyards. So the cowboys would sing these slow and relaxing, soulful songs to keep the cows from moving at a fast pace, to keep them slowed down. And of course, this led, as you know, to the development of country music. And standing to the right is a genuine country artist. You all know him as George Strait. And that is, of course, Garth Brooks, the no-talent tool of the corporate music industry, who has absolutely no claim to being a country music artist. I just thought I'd throw that out there. I'm sorry if you disagree. You're just wrong. If we go back and survey the land in 1862, the same year that Congress passed the Homestead Act in hopes of populating the West, we'd see that most Americans considered the Trans-Mississippi region to be something they called the Great American Desert. Now, the problem with calling it that is that it's not actually deserted. You've got scores of Native American populations, hundreds of different societies populating the Trans-Mississippi West, and they don't have a whole lot of interest in moving on. Of course, this is going to lead to a clash of cultures. Native Americans numbered about 360,000 in 1860, and they're not one homogenized group. They're organized into numerous societies, each with a claim to a distinct history, language, and culture. And when white soldiers and settlers edged onto the plains in the decades before the Civil War, they accelerated this fateful cycle that exacerbated already fierce enmities among the Indians and ultimately undermined the foundations of Native American culture. After the Civil War, most Americans look at the Indians as obstacles to civilization. They stood in the way of the railroad, the farmer, the prospector, the miner, the land surveyor, and even the cattle driver. And so the U.S. government is going to engage in a brutal and costly war against the Indian civilizations in the West. What happened in the West in the late 19th century was nothing less than a full-on, full-scale war of extermination against the Native Americans. It was waged by the U.S. Army in the wake of the Civil War. It was a bit of a nation-building experience where the North and the South could join hands in something that we could all agree with, which is that we want the West to be clear of Indians. All of the battles that are waged are too numerous and too detailed for me to go into, but just so you know that it was a one-sided war in which economic disparity and disease favored the white settlers over the Native Americans. As these Indian wars, so to speak, drew to a close, Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce people gave a speech to the young and the old assembled in his group, and it has gone down as one of these iconic speeches of American history. He writes, "Our chiefs are killed. The old men are all dead. It is the young men who now say yes or no. It is cold and we have no blankets. The little children are freezing to death. My people, some of them have run away to the hills and have no blankets and no food. No one knows where they are, perhaps freezing to death. I want to have time to look for my children and see how many of them I can find. Maybe I shall find them among the dead. Hear me, my chiefs. My heart is sick and sad. From where the sun now stands, I will fight no more against the white man." American policymakers back in Washington are torn between two options. On the one hand, you have a policy that says the only good Indian is a dead Indian. This was articulated by General Philip Sheridan, one of the Civil War turned Indian fighters. This would mean extermination, continue to wage warfare on them and kill them. The other option is more of a progressive option, and I don't mean that in a modern sense. I mean this is more of the progressive impulse to do something good through legislation, and that would be to kill the Indian and save the man. And what we mean by this is assimilation. So what is the direction the United States government is going to take? Are we going to continue to wage open war on the Indians, which doesn't make for good press? Or are we going to try to assimilate the Native American into mainstream white society? Somebody in Washington has an idea. They take note at how the Indians survive. This goes all the way back to 1451. It's a Spanish report on the Indians. They write, "With the skins, the Indians build their houses. The skins they clothe and shoe themselves. From the skins they make ropes and also obtain wool. From the sinews they make thread, which they then sew in their their clothing and likewise their tents. From the bones they shave awls, and the dung they use for firewood, since there is no fuel in all that land. The bladders serve as jugs and drinking vessels. They sustain themselves on the flesh of the animals, eating it slightly roasted and sometimes uncooked. Taking it in their teeth, they pull with one hand, with the other they hold a large flint knife and cut off mouthfuls, swallowing it half chewed like birds. They eat raw fat without warming it." So, from the Spanish report on the Indians, we can tell that they use the buffalo for a whole lot. In fact, they are dependent on the buffalo for their livelihood. So Washington says, why not just wage a war on the buffalo? Don't wage it directly on the Indians. This is costly. This costs us lives and money. Let's wage a war on their means to live. The bison. I know we call him the buffalo, but he's actually the bison, the American bison. The Plains Indians depend on the bison for everything. For food, for clothing, for shelter, for religious purposes. The bison means everything to them. It's a traveling economy. A dead bison means an Indian family goes without food or shelter for a season. And American farmers will have more land to pasture, and the Indians will be forced to surrender. So from Washington's perspective, this is a win-win scenario. And so railroads and hunters are going to be encouraged to hunt down the American bison. And one of the ways this is going to take place is through the trains, in which you'll have buffalo or bison hunting parties that will stop as they see the herds on these trains, and everybody will pull out their rifles and shoot as many as possible. Sometimes they'll take their hides or their tongues, and sometimes if they're in a hurry, they'll just leave them to rot. Either way, it means that the Indians are not going to have a means to subsistence. Another famous picture from Harper's Weekly, in which the bison are literally crowding the railroad tracks, and the passengers are going to stop and get off the train, pull out their rifles, and shoot them. Again, sometimes the hides and the tongues will be used or sold, and sometimes they'll be left to rot on the plains because it means the Indians won't have them anymore. There's a buffalo hunter sitting on top of his many hides. General Philip Sheridan puts it this way: these men, buffalo hunters, have done more in the last 2 years and will do in the next year more to settle the vexed Indian question than the entire regular army has done in the last 30 years. They are destroying the Indians' commissary. It is well known that an army is losing its base of supplies, is placed at a greater disadvantage. For the sake of lasting peace, let them kill, skin, and sell until the buffaloes are exterminated. Then your prairies can be covered with speckled cattle and festive cowboy, who follows the hunter as a second forerunner of an advanced civilization. So clearly General Philip Sheridan believes that clearing out the buffalo and exterminating the Indians is going to be a way to pave the way for the advance of white civilization. Now, it's important to note that when I talk about progressivism, I'm not talking about it in a modern sense, like this makes progress or this is necessarily a good thing. When we speak of progressivism, we're speaking of that historical movement in the late 19th century in which primarily white, urban, middle-class Americans decided that the world could be made a better place through excessive legislation by passing laws and engineering the good society, in effect bringing about things like social justice and progress through the arm of government. This is what we mean by progressivism. There's a whole lecture on progressivism in the East, in the urban areas, in the slums, in the cities, but progressivism also had an effect on the plains in America's dealings with the Native Americans. So the progressive reformers found the Army's solution to the Indian question to be horrifying, barbaric, far too bloody. And so they promoted an alternative vision, which is typified by the phrase, kill the Indian and save the man. By that, they meant assimilation. They wanted to transform the Indian into what they considered to be a savage, into a civilized American citizen. And so in 1887, Congress passed the Dawes Plan, a program which dissolved all existing treaties with Indians and claims to their ancestral land. Once again, the Dawes Plan dissolves all existing treaties with the Indians and cancels all of their claims to the ancestral lands. That's a pretty big deal. What it then does is that reallocates all of the old Indian land into 160-acre plots, and it's going to give those plots to each male head of a nuclear family. And in 25 years of ownership, that land, 160 acres, would pass to the male head of the household, whoever is still living. So was the Dawes Plan a Homestead Act for Indians? Well, yeah, this is how the progressive reformers saw it. The Indians are going to be given 160 acres to farm, and they're going to own it eventually just like the whites. So to the progressive reformers, this seems to be a really good idea and not racist at all. It's simply helping these people become more civilized. But the problem is, Indians are bison hunters. They're not Jeffersonian farmers. They don't have a tradition of Jeffersonian farming, and they don't want to become Jeffersonian farmers. And the problem with the Dawes Plan is that it's mismanaged. Corruption is rank throughout the Western governments that allocate these lands, the territorial governments that allocate these lands, and the best land is going to go to whites, while the arid and unfarmable land is going to go to the Indians. Most Indians really don't like the idea anyway. They abandon the white idea of land ownership after a few seasons and simply walk away. The entire Dawes Act was predicated entirely on white assumptions about family. Many Native American tribes were matrilineal, not patrilineal, and didn't have a sense of property passing through the male line. It's also predicated on assumptions about land ownership. A lot of Native Americans find the idea of land ownership to be preposterous. How do you own the land? Do you also own the air? Do you own the water? What does this mean? And so property rights, land ownership, this does not make sense to a lot of Native Americans. Also, gender roles. We mentioned, what does it mean to be a male head of the household? It assumes that everybody is a Victorian Protestant and has the same understanding of what male roles are and female roles are. Also of economics. What does it mean to make a living? For an Indian, that means to hunt, and your pride and your family is based on that. And to white Anglo-Saxons, your economic means is met by farming. So the Dawes Act assumes that the Indians think like white people. And this is why it fails. Well, you can see from this advertisement, which is as late as 1910, the United States government is going to be selling Indian lands. It has dispossessed all of the Indians in the West and is going to be allocating those lands to anybody who will buy it. Fine lands in the West, it says, irrigated, irrigable, grazing, agricultural, dry farming. What do you need? Well, ultimately, the Dawes Act was a failure. It did not work. The Indians did not want to buy into Jeffersonian farming, and so American government goes with Plan B, the Americanization plan, just as they were doing with the new immigrants. You are looking at a picture of the Carlisle Indian School, founded in 1879, and those pupils in front of you are Indians. They're Native American boys and girls being trained to turn into white citizens. The Carlisle Indian School was founded by progressive reformers and white Christian missionaries with the intent of transforming Indians into what they considered savages into white American citizens. So you can see these are some of the transformations that Indians are expected to go through at the Carlisle Indian School. This guy gets himself a nice haircut and a new suit. This young woman is transformed into a respectable blushing bride, complete with a white dress. And here you have a picture of the three Lakota boys, the before in the traditional Indian costume, and afterwards looking like respectable young, civilized Victorian men. And as I mentioned, the Carlisle Indian School and many other Indian schools, so-called Indian schools, are staffed by white missionaries. The Quakers, the Baptists, and the Methodists were your favorite of the Grant administration. And they often competed with one another for converts, wondering who was going to round up the most Indians and convert them to their version of Christianity. And in front of you are two government advertisements selling the taxpayer on what is going to be happening in the Carlisle Indian School. As you can see, the girls are going to be trained in the domestic arts such as laundry and tailoring and sewing, and the boys are going to be trained to be blacksmiths, wagon wheelwrights, and engaged in other industrial pursuits. So there's a definite gender difference as well. And don't forget farming. One of the main goals is to teach Indians how to be good Jeffersonian farmers. And here they are at the Carlisle Indian School learning just that. In 1881, a historian named Helen Hunt Jackson writes a book called A Century of Dishonor, and she makes sure that every member of Congress gets a copy of it as well. Well, it didn't help too much, but it's one of these books that sort of stands as a testament of white Indian relations throughout the 18th and 19th century. She writes, "The history of the government connections with the Indians is a shameful record of broken treaties and unfulfilled promises. The history of the border, white man's connection with the Indian, is a sickening record of murder, outrage, robbery, and wrongs committed by the former. As the rule, and occasional savage outbreaks and unspeakably barbarous deeds of retaliation by the latter as the exception. That is the refusal of the protection of the law to the Indians' rights of property, of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." From Helen Hunt Jackson, A Century of Dishonor. Just a reminder, in the late 19th century, immigrants were coming in at both ends of the United States. Ellis Island in New York and Angel Island in California. Ellis Island was the primary port of entry for European immigrants, whereas Angel Island was the port of entry for Asian immigrants. Why were Asians coming into the United States? We're talking about Chinese immigrants as well as Japanese immigrants. They were coming for the same reasons that the European immigrants were coming. Jobs, jobs, and jobs, and perhaps even the hope of land ownership. The Chinese especially were coming to work in the transcontinental railroads, knowing that there would be work there that they could send home, work there that they could take up, and wages that they could send home. They take jobs that white people are often unwilling to do. Well, it is only a matter of time before white citizens, just as they began to look at the Irish or the Polish or the Jews or the Catholics, whoever back east, begin to become upset with the influx of Asian immigration. And so you see here a boycott taking place. A general boycott has been declared upon all Chinese and Japanese restaurants, tailor shops, and wash houses. Also all persons employing them in any capacity. And I want you to look at why. All friends and sympathizers of organized labor will assist us in this fight against the lowering Asiatic standards of living and morals. Organized labor is going to... So take a closer look. This is an address from the working men of San Francisco to their brothers throughout the Pacific Coast. We have met here in San Francisco tonight to raise our voice to you in warning of a great danger that seems to us imminent and threatens our almost utter destruction as a prosperous community. Today, every avenue to labor of every sort is crowded with Chinese slave labor, worse than it was 8 years ago. The boot, shoe, and cigar industries are almost entirely in their hands. In the manufacture of men's overalls and women's and children's underwear, they run over 3,000 sewing machines night and day. They monopolize nearly all the farming done to supply the market with all sorts of vegetables. This state of things brings about a terrible competition between our own people, who must live as civilized Americans, and the Chinese, who live like degraded slaves. We should all understand that this state of things cannot be much longer endured. So why are they protesting? Why are the working men of San Francisco protesting? They're protesting the loss of potential labor. The Chinese are coming in and monopolizing every industry that we might get along in. The Chinese are coming along and they're doing everything that we might use to make a living, and so they must be ejected, says the working men of San Francisco. Have a look at this cartoon. At the top it says, the new issue, the Chinese-American question. And at the bottom it says, the martyrdom of St. Crispin. St. Crispin was the patron saint of shoemakers. And so you've got him symbolizing the average American who just wants to make a living. And look at the sword. And look at what is printed on the sword of the Chinese guy who's about to cut his head off. Cheap labor. This is what the Chinese are doing. They're coming in and they're flooding the market with cheap labor, denying the white worker his due. Another cartoon, this one is more sympathetic to the Chinese laborer. You can see all of the accusations that people are hurling against him printed on the wall. The Chinese question, coolie, slave, pauper, rat eater, he's the lowest, he's the vilest. All of these things, you can go over them. And then you have Lady Liberty there, who's offering him a protective hand. See, there he is. In 1882, Congress responds to the demands for a limitation on the Chinese labor through the Chinese Exclusion Act. Whereas, in the opinion of the government of the United States, the coming of Chinese labor to this country endangers the good order of certain localities within the United States. The Chinese are banned because they're threatening good order. I imagine it's all of the riots that are going on and the violence that are taking place against the Chinese who come in. That before any Chinese passengers are landed from any such line vessel, the collector or his deputy shall proceed to examine such passenger, comparing the certificate with the list and with the passengers, and no passenger shall be allowed to land in the United States from such vessel in violation of the law. The United States is going to enforce this by examining all of the shipping that comes in and comparing the certificate with the list with the passengers, and nobody's going to come in if you are found to be Chinese. That every vessel whose master shall knowingly violate any of the provisions of this act shall be deemed forfeited to the United States and shall be liable to the seizure and condemnation in any district of the United States into which vessel may enter. It's aimed at people who may be bringing in Chinese labor. So it's not just aimed at the Chinese laborer himself, it's aimed at those who would bring them in and pay them less. This cartoon takes aim at this policy as well, stating e pluribus unum at the bottom. Of course, that means out of many, one, except the Chinese. Consider the case of Wong Kim Ark. Wong Kim Ark was born in San Francisco in 1873. Now, under the 14th Amendment, this makes him a citizen. But at the age of 21, he returned to China, that is, returned to the birthplace of his parents, not his birthplace, returned to China to visit his parents. And on his way back, he's denied re-entry into the United States under the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Well, Wong Kim Ark doesn't much care for this, and he sues the state of California for enforcing it, and the case goes to the Supreme Court in 1898. So what do you think? Constitutionally speaking, how should the court rule in the case of U.S. v. Wong Kim Ark? Should he be allowed back in, or should he not? Does the Chinese Exclusion Act
Does it apply to people who were born in the United States but who are of Chinese ancestry?
The majority decision says the American citizenship which Wong Kim Ark required by birth within the United States has not been lost or taken away by anything happening since his birth. So the court decided, no, you have to let him in. He's a United States citizen. And so what part of the U.S. Constitution did the court reference to uphold his citizenship? Once again, the 14th Amendment, which offers every U.S. citizen, whether born here or naturalized, equal protection under the law.